It was supposed to be a weekend away from the noise. I had just moved to Oregon for work, and with no real friends yet, I figured a solo camping trip would be the perfect way to clear my head. There was something romantic about the idea of being completely alone in nature, the crisp air, the silence. No emails, no meetings, just me and the forest. I chose a spot deep in the Cascades, an area I had read about online but hadn't been to before. It was remote but not completely off the grid, just secluded enough that I wouldn't have to deal with noisy hikers. The drive took most of the afternoon, winding roads leading me further and further into the wilderness until finally, I reached a small gravel turnout where I parked my car. The forest was dense here, thick with towering pines that swayed slightly in the cool breeze. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started hiking. It took me about an hour to find the perfect clearing. Flat ground, surrounded by trees, not too far from a stream. By the time I had my tent up and a small fire going, the sun was beginning to set. I made dinner, just a simple freeze-dried meal, and sat by the fire, letting the night wash over me. That's when I heard it. A humming sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling fire, but distinct enough to make me stop chewing. It wasn't coming from the trees or the wind. It was human. Someone was humming a tune in the distance. I turned off my headlamp, letting the fire be my only source of light. The humming was slow, rhythmic, carrying through the trees in an almost hypnotic way. I felt a cold prickle run down my spine. No one should be out here. I sat still, straining to hear. The sound was coming from somewhere behind my tent, deeper in the forest. I stood up, holding my flashlight but not turning it on yet. The humming stopped. Silence. I swallowed. Hello? I called out, my voice almost too quiet. Nothing. I shook it off, forcing myself to think rationally. Maybe it was another camper. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I tried to laugh at myself, sat back down, and stoked the fire. Then, about an hour later, something changed. The trees felt closer. The fire seemed dimmer. The air felt heavy. And then, I heard it again. The humming. But this time, it was closer. This time, I could hear the voice behind it. Low, raspy, like someone trying to remember a song they had long forgotten. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just blackness. But something was there. I felt it. I decided I was done playing games. I doused my fire, grabbed my bag, and made a beeline for my tent. I'd sleep inside and deal with whatever this was in the morning. But as I zipped my tent shut, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunches in the dirt. Then, a shadow passed in front of my tent. I held my breath. The footsteps circled my tent once, twice. I could hear breathing. Not loud, but just enough to make my stomach clench. Then, something pressed against the fabric. Not a hand, not an animal, a face. I could see the imprint of lips, a nose, hollowed eye sockets pushing against the thin fabric of my tent. My entire body froze. The humming started again. This time, it was right in my ear. I screamed, kicked at the shape, and scrambled for the zipper. In a blind panic, I tore my way out of the tent and ran. Ran without looking back, ran through the trees, ran until my lungs burned. I reached my car, locked myself inside, and sat there, gripping the wheel, panting, staring out into the darkness. I was terrified to turn on the headlights, to see if something was standing at the edge of the woods. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I drove away, leaving my tent, my gear, everything. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there. But when I checked my phone later, I found something that made my blood run cold. The voice recorder app was open, and on it was a 30-second recording. A voice, humming, and then, at the very end, a whisper, "Don't leave." Story 2. Moving into my new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. It was nothing fancy, just a small studio on the third floor of an older brick building in the heart of downtown. The rent was cheap, and the previous tenant had left in a hurry, meaning I got most of their furniture for free. It was the perfect setup for someone like me, someone just trying to get their life back on track. I had been there for about a week when I first noticed something strange. At night, when the building was quiet, I would hear scratching. It was faint, barely there at first, like a branch tapping against a window. I figured it was just the old pipes or maybe a rat in the walls. But then I started to notice the pattern. Every night, around 2:33 a.m., the scratching would start. It always came from the same spot, inside the closet. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an old building making old building noises. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it got under my skin. One night, I decided I had had enough. I grabbed my phone, walked over to the closet, and yanked the door open. Nothing, just my clothes hanging there, untouched. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling stupid for even being nervous. But just as I turned to walk away, scratch. I spun back around so fast my stomach dropped. The noise had come from inside the wall. I placed my ear against it, my heart pounding. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like something was trying to get out. That night, I slept with the lights on. A few nights later, the scratching changed. Instead of coming from the closet, it moved to the wall behind my bed. The sound was sharper, more deliberate. I swore I could hear something dragging along the drywall. Then, one night, I woke up to something different. Not scratching, not tapping, whispering. It was so quiet I almost thought I was dreaming. But then, something knocked from inside the wall. 3 slow, heavy knocks. I shot out of bed, turned on every light in the apartment, and sat there, shaking. I didn't go back to sleep. The next day, I told my landlord about it. I expected him to brush it off, maybe say it was just pipes or insulation shifting, but instead, his face paled slightly. That unit has had a few complaints before, he admitted, scratching the back of his head. I pressed him for more. Finally, he sighed and leaned in slightly, as if telling me a secret. The last guy who lived there, he, disappeared, never broke his lease, just stopped paying rent. We had to get the cops involved. But when they entered the apartment, his stuff was still there. His phone, wallet, everything. Like he had just vanished. A cold chill ran down my spine. That night, I sat in bed, staring at the closet, wondering if I should just pack my things and leave. Then, at exactly 2:33 a.m., the scratching started again. But this time, there was a voice. Low, raspy, just above a whisper. Let me out. My blood turned to ice. I stood up slowly, gripping my phone with shaky fingers. I stepped toward the closet, my breath caught in my throat. The scratching stopped. I held my breath. Then, the closet door slid open. On its own, I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping in the cold night air. I moved out the next day. I don't know what was in that closet, or in the walls, but I do know one thing. The previous tenant never left. And whatever was scratching to get out wasn't human anymore. Story 3. I never should have taken the shortcut. It was late, and I had just finished a shift at the restaurant where I worked. The drive home was about 30 minutes on the main highway, but I had been awake since early that morning, my eyelids heavy as I sat behind the wheel. That's when I remembered the back road. It was a narrow, winding path through the woods, barely used, but it cut my commute in half. I had only driven it once before, during the day, and even then, it had felt eerie. Towering trees on both sides, thick enough that they blocked out most of the sunlight. But that night, the road felt different. The moment I turned onto it, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The trees loomed taller in the darkness, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. My headlights barely cut through the fog that had settled over the road. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my breath coming out slow and controlled, forcing myself to shake the feeling. It was just a road. Then I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was an animal, something just at the edge of my high beams. But as I got closer, my stomach lurched. It was a woman, standing on the side of the road, barefoot, dressed in a long, pale nightgown. She wasn't waving for help. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there. Her head was tilted slightly, her long, dark hair covering most of her face. I felt my hands go cold against the steering wheel. I should have kept driving, but instead, I slowed down. As my car rolled past her, I kept my eyes straight ahead, not daring to look directly at her. But in my peripheral vision, I could see her turning her head toward me. I hit the gas. My heart was hammering as I sped down the road, forcing myself not to check the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see her standing in the road behind me. I was almost at the end of the shortcut when I saw something ahead. No, that wasn't possible. The woman, standing in the middle of the road this time. My stomach twisted so hard I nearly lost control of the car. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding against the gravel. She had no face. Where her eyes and mouth should have been was just smooth, pale skin. And yet, I could feel her watching me. My breath came in sharp gasps as I threw the car into reverse, slamming my foot on the accelerator. My tires screamed against the pavement as I sped backward, my eyes darting between the road behind me and the thing standing ahead. Then, she moved. Not walked. Glided. Straight toward my car. The moment I saw her moving, I let out a strangled yell, jerked the wheel, and swung the car into a ditch. The impact was jarring, but I didn't stop. I scrambled out of the driver's seat, my legs burning as I sprinted back toward the highway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. By the time I reached the main road, I was gasping for air, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I called the police, trying to explain where I was, but when they arrived, my car was still there. But the woman was gone. The officers didn't believe me, but they did say one thing before they left. They told me I wasn't the first person to report seeing her. I wasn't the first to take the shortcut and come out with a story, and I sure as hell wouldn't be the last. I never used that road again, but sometimes, when I drive the highway late at night, I see something in my rearview mirror. Just a glimpse. A woman in a pale nightgown, standing just beyond the trees. Watching. Story 4. I used to work the night shift at a gas station on the outskirts of town. It was one of those isolated stations, the kind that barely saw any traffic after midnight. Most nights were quiet, just me, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the occasional trucker stopping in for coffee or cigarettes. But one night, I met him. It was around 2:45 a.m. when I noticed the old, beat-up car parked by the farthest pump. The car had been sitting there for a while, but no one had gotten out. At first, I figured the driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, but something about it made me uneasy. The station had security cameras, so I checked the monitors. The screen flickered slightly, static distorting the image, but I could make out the shadow of a man sitting in the driver's seat. Not moving, just staring. A full 30 minutes passed, and still, he didn't get out. I told myself to ignore it. Maybe he was just resting. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But then, the door to the station chimed. I turned around and nearly jumped out of my skin. The man was inside. I hadn't seen him get out of the car. I hadn't heard footsteps. But now, here he was, standing at the back of the store near the refrigerators, just staring at me. He was tall, unnaturally tall. His shoulders hunched forward as if he were too big for his own body. His face was wrong, like the features had been stretched just slightly out of proportion. His eyes were deep-set and hollow, his lips thin and cracked, and he was smiling. It was the kind of smile that made my stomach turn, too wide, too forced. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. He just tilted his head, as if studying me. Then, slowly, he walked backward, step by step, until he disappeared down one of the aisles. The store fell into dead silence. My heart was hammering in my chest. I stepped out from behind the counter, peering down the aisle he had gone into. Empty. There was no one there. But when I turned back toward the counter, I froze. He was standing right in front of me, less than 3 feet away. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't seen him. But now, he was there, close enough that I could smell his breath. Damp, sour, like something that had been left to rot. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a display of candy. His smile never wavered. Then he spoke. His voice was wrong. Too deep, too slow, like a recording being played at half speed. "You've seen me before." A cold chill ran down my spine. I shook my head. "I don't think so, man." The smile widened. "Yes, you have." I was done. I bolted toward the counter, reaching for the phone. The lights flickered, then went out. I stood frozen in the pitch-black store, my breath coming out in short gasps. My fingers fumbled for my phone. for the flashlight, for anything. Then, just as suddenly as they went off, the lights came back on. The man was gone. The store was empty. I checked the security cameras again, rewinding the footage, expecting to see him walk out. But he hadn't. One frame, he was there. The next, gone. I quit my job the next morning, but sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I see his face, watching me, smiling. Story 5. I never wanted a roommate, but rent in the city was brutal. When I found an ad for a cheap room in a 2-bedroom apartment, I jumped on it. The guy renting it out, Ben, seemed normal enough. Early 30s, quiet, worked nights as a security guard. We barely saw each other, which honestly was perfect for me. The first week was uneventful. We kept to ourselves, exchanged polite nods in the kitchen, and that was about it. But then, things started to get strange. It began with the noises. Late at night, I would hear footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate pacing. At first, I assumed it was Ben coming home from work. But one night, I heard the footsteps stop right outside my bedroom door. Just standing there. I held my breath, listening. No knock, no movement, just silence. I finally worked up the nerve to check. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. That was the first time I felt the cold spot. The air outside my door was freezing, like I had just stepped into a walk-in freezer. I shivered and quickly shut the door, locking it. The next morning, I casually mentioned to Ben that I'd heard him walking around at night. His expression went blank. "I wasn't home last night," he said. A chill ran down my spine. "Maybe you left the TV on," he added, brushing it off. But I knew what I heard. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of scratching. Not mice. Not the pipes. Something was scraping against the floor outside my room. I held my breath and turned on my phone's flashlight. The glow barely reached the space under my door, but what I saw made my stomach drop. Fingers. Thin, pale fingers pressed against the bottom of the door, unmoving. I choked back a gasp, scrambling out of bed. My heart pounded as I grabbed the heaviest thing in my room. A lamp, ready to swing. The fingers twitched. And then, slowly, they slid away. I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The cold spot was back. I decided I needed to talk to Ben. When he got home that morning, I confronted him. "There's something wrong with this apartment," I said. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice." I stared at him. "What the hell does that mean?" He hesitated, then finally muttered, "The last guy who lived here, he, went missing. Just disappeared. Never took his stuff. Never told anyone he was leaving. Cops didn't find anything." I felt my blood run cold. Ben looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I hear things too, sometimes. But I figure, if I don't mess with it, it won't mess with me." I didn't sleep that night. I kept my door locked. I kept the lights on. But at 3:07 a.m., my bedroom door unlocked itself. I heard the soft click of the knob turning. The door creaked open just an inch. Enough for me to see someone standing in the hallway. Not Ben. Not anyone human. The thing had no eyes. Just dark, gaping holes where they should have been. It smiled, the skin around its mouth splitting open too wide, as if it had never used lips before. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Then, in a voice that wasn't mine, it whispered, "He never left." I slammed the door and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I don't know what happened to the last guy who lived in that room, but sometimes, when I wake up in my new apartment, I find my bedroom door cracked open, and the cold spot? It followed me.